Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Friday Show. I'm Ray Paulick, joined by Natalie Voss, Paulick Report Editor-in-Chief. Brought to you by Monmouth Park. Their 3-day weekend races are all early post times now, so don't forget the Friday post times are early. You've got the Win Early Pick 5 and plenty of good racing left at the Jersey Shore until the end of the meet. Well, Natalie, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the federal drug case, Jorge Navarro pleading guilty. And this week, we learned a lot more about the case in terms of some of the wiretap information. You wrote a piece earlier this week, what we learned from new wiretap evidence in the federal drug case. And what I learned was that this is sickening. I mean, frankly, this is disgusting behavior by some of these defendants. And I'm just going to start off with one small example and then turn it over to you. This was a conversation between Jorge Navarro and Michael Tenuza. Both were indicted. Jorge Navarro was pleaded guilty. Navarro says, what I'm going to do is tap his ankles, put him in a series every week with SGF. I'm just trying my vet to give me a good price, man, because I want to effing charge the effing tap every week. Tenuza, you're going to tap him every week. Navarro, yeah, with SGF. That's what I did with XY Jet. I'm going to call my vet up north my surgeon to see how he did it to XY Jet, and that's it. Don't worry, man. You're in good hands. Don't worry. Tenuzo, you're talking about the HGF, not the SGF. Yeah, whatever the SGF, whatever. The thing that you sent me, the syringe. Tenuzo, yeah. Navarro, yeah. And he is getting one of those SGF 1000 whatever. He's getting one today. So these are people entrusted to take care of horses that are putting stuff into an animal. They don't even know what it is. They have no clue what it is. There are other transcripts where they say, I don't know what it is, but it sure works like hell. This is a mess. And this is not just two people. This stuff was being sold all over the country, and people using it without having a clue as far as what it was.
Yeah, I mean, very often we saw throughout the little snippets of transcripts, they couldn't remember the name of different things. I have a feeling if they couldn't remember what it was called, they couldn't really remember what it was. It still sort of is very unclear. SGF 1000 is the drug that kind of gets the spotlight in the little snippets of transcripts that we got today, or last week, I should say. But we still don't know what that is. We know how it was advertised. The way it was advertised changed at different points in time, depending on whether the drug makers thought there was regulatory scrutiny on them. We've learned in other documents that, in fact, the company in Nicholasville, Kentucky, that was distributing the stuff may or may not have actually been compounding it themselves. It sounds like they might have been importing it. Whether the imported product was the finished product or not, I don't know. Whether they put anything else in it before they sold it, who knows? And there's actually a passage from Dr. Christian Rhine, who has entered a guilty plea. And I don't remember if he's talking to Servis or Navarro, but it's an intercepted phone call where he's being asked about, is there any risk that this has something in it that will test? And he's talking about the differences between growth factor and growth hormone. And he sort of has a conversation with himself about, well, I don't think it has growth hormone in it. But I don't know. I need to research that. But I don't think so. And I'm thinking, like, how much of this have you sold? And you don't even know what's in it and whether or not. He believes that it works. But if you don't know what it is in there that works, how can you even really know how much of an effect it's having?
Yeah, there's other references to clenbuterol in these wiretaps. Not the Ventapulman FDA-approved clenbuterol, which they referred to as regular. But apparently there was a compounded clenbuterol that maybe got through the testing process easier based on some of the conversations that were intercepted. Not only was Navarro, he's guilty now, guilty of giving drugs to horses that he didn't understand. According to this document, he served both as a facilitator of another trainer's doping activities, Nick Surik from the Standardbred game, but as a kind of doping mentor. So, he's out there teaching people how to cheat. And frankly, I hope they throw the book at him when it comes to sentencing.
Yeah, we won't know that for a few more weeks at least. I don't think they've actually set a date for his sentencing hearing, but I'll be very curious to see what they do. They have a few different passages where Surik has called him and is panicking because he's given a blood-building substance to a horse, and the New Jersey Commission has now shown up to do an out-of-competition test on the horse. And they detail, I think they detailed in the original indictment possibly too, that Surik hid the horse for a period of time, moved it around on the facility, then moved it off the facility to try to evade testers. And I think that the testers showed up more than once looking for the horse. And so you have him in the background apparently calling Navarro saying, well, I gave him this stuff. And so how many days before I can actually let them at him to test him? And Navarro seems to have very authoritative answers on, well, at 3 days, you're not good. At 4 days, you might be okay. And you have to wonder, does he actually know that? How does he actually know that? How can he be so sure, when things will clear tests? Is this because he's had stuff independently tested? Or is this just based on his trial and error experience from using products at different times and getting post-race or out of competition tests and finding himself to be skating through cleanly? There's also conversations that have taken place apparently between, I think it was Dr. Christian Ryan makes reference to having spoken to someone in California who is involved with drug testing, and he does not say who it is. We don't know who it is, who was asked to test SGF 1000 and saw Ryan someplace wearing his Medivet equine hat and volunteered, oh, I've tested that stuff. I can't find anything in it, which is also a little bit concerning. So it seems like these guys sort of have a lot of knowledge about testing or believe they have a lot of knowledge about testing and how to get around it, short of just, like closing your eyes, injecting the syringe and praying. They seem to actually think that they have data on this. Whether they do or not, of course, we don't know.
There were other recorded or intercepted conversations where I believe both Navarro and Servis were almost worried they were going to get caught because they were winning too much. The Navarro making reference to a horse that just effing galloped in a race after getting one of these substances, and Servis having a conversation with his assistant about, we've got to be careful because if we win too much, basically they'll be onto us. And he even, I don't know if they were joking or not, but saying that there would be people in the trees outside the barns doing surveillance on them and that sort of a thing. So another troubling thing that I got out of this was that Servis, according to the U.S. attorney, Servis was actively assisting Navarro to conceal Navarro's doping practices by tipping off Navarro to the presence of track officials. Navarro was willing to confide in Servis regarding his own doping practices and about his own corrupt relationship with an unnamed racetrack security official. And it said Navarro believed Servis had his own corrupt relationship with a racetrack security official. So this has now gone beyond trainers, veterinarians, and suppliers, but people who work, according to this document, who work at the racetrack, for the racetrack, or for the commissions.
Yeah, that was especially discouraging to read, although not wholly surprising when you think about, how many years they had possibly been doing this.
Right.
And it sort of comes into play too, the whole reason that, or not the whole reason, but part of the reason that the prosecutors are trying so hard to keep this wiretap evidence in the case. I should say that the reason we have these conversations is because several of the defendants are trying to get the wiretaps thrown out. The prosecutors are pushing back on that, obviously saying, no, they were legitimately obtained. Here's pieces of what we obtained that had us, sort of interested, that enabled us to continue getting new approval for new wiretaps throughout this investigation. And one of the things that I think some of the defendants had tried to say when they were trying to get this thrown out was, well, you had other investigative sort of techniques available to you. And the prosecutors went through sort of the input from the FBI and said, here are all the things that we would normally do to try to surveil somebody, and here's why they're not going to work in this case. And it really sort of drove home a point that, I've made before, which is that whether you're an investigator on law enforcement or you're an investigator in journalism, you really can't get a lot on these guys unless you're listening to them talking to each other, because they're going to be very surreptitious about bringing stuff into the barn, They talked about we could try placing cameras in different places, but it's much more likely they'd notice the cameras than the cameras would actually catch anything, because they're doing this at odd hours. They're switching horses around. They're trying to make it unclear what is getting what substance. These bottles are not well labeled. It's not always clear just because you saw a horse get an injection, whether that was a misbranded drug or not, or which horse that is. They were not confident that they could plant a person in the barn or in any of these veterinary operations without being very quickly detected. And there's intercepted conversations in here too about some of the drug distributors saying, well, can you trust so-and-so? And they're talking about potential clients. They're talking about, do we want to open up this sort of chest of illegal products to this trainer who's asking about it, because we want to make sure that we're not going to get turned in. They were vetting the people around them very carefully, and they were keeping their circles very tight. So it's disgusting, but not, when I think about it, wholly surprising that part of their scheme to try to keep themselves under wraps probably involved knowing a lot about what security was doing and when they might be coming and when they might not be coming.
There was a reference in there to Navarro showing up at his barn at midnight to do stuff. That's not normal behavior, I don't think. So I don't know when the judge is going to rule on whether or not this wiretap evidence is permissible, but I believe if the judge rules in favor of the U.S. attorney and the FBI here, don't you get the feeling that this is sort of a Hail Mary pass by many of the defendants? And if they lose this, then we'll see a series of guilty pleas.
I think with some of them, this is probably their last ditch effort. There's others that have been a little bit more aggressive in fighting every stage of this case that they can, who I think might try to prevail, although they're not certainly denying that these are their clients on these intercepted phone calls. So if you're not denying that that's your guy talking about an illegal drug, I'm not quite sure how you fight a misbranding charge, but I do think that if they lose this, they're going to be in some trouble. And this has also gone on for a long time. So for some of these defendants, including some that I think have already changed their pleas, they're also having to factor in, can they continue to afford to pay lawyers to keep fighting this case as it kind of builds up against them a little more. So I will be curious to see what happens if the wiretap evidence gets left in. Where do they go from here?
Well, one of the defendants who did plead guilty, Scott Mangini, is I guess he's scheduled for sentencing Friday, correct?
Yes, Friday at noon. He was a pharmacist who actually we had reported on for some years. I'm a little bit familiar with him. So when he popped up in this case, I was very interested. But the defense and the prosecutors have each submitted their recommendations for sentencing. Obviously, the defense wants him to get as little time in jail as possible. I think they actually are advocating for home confinement, and the government is pushing for as long of a prison sentence as they can get. So reading through that documentation has been interesting. Obviously, they're, as usual, operating with conflicting goals. Robinson's sort of story is, well, most of what I sold, what I sold the most of through horse pre-race and racehorse meds and ergogenic labs and his various sort of business fronts, most of what I was selling was omeprazole and some EPM medications, which, by the way, were not FDA-approved versions of those medications. And I was just trying to be helpful. And then the government kind of comes back and says, what about things like Blast Off Red? What about Yellow Extreme, or some of the other sort of named products that he produced and sold that were clearly designed to appear as performance enhancers? There's a number of really sort of stomach-turning documents in their filings that detail, like, this was not benign stuff. This was stuff that might have, and in at least one case did have serious negative effects on the horses that ingested or were injected with those products. So we'll see what they end up doing with him. They're sort of looking towards the deal that was made with Scott Robinson, saying, well, we shouldn't get any more time than he did. But I'm not sure how compelling a judge will find that argument. In
addition, when you reported on these pharmacists a number of years ago, before this investigation opened, I believe there was some action by the state of Florida against them, and it referenced the unsanitary conditions in which they were making these drugs, and there were some complaints from customers about just bugs in the bottles, and stuff that somebody, I think, filed a complaint saying that they're going to kill some horses with this stuff. It's just really kind of terrible stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's sort of important to note that like Mangini and Robinson were sort of producing some products that were designed to appear as pets, and some products that were designed to appear as sort of harmless, cheaper copies of prescription drugs that were out there that maybe somebody didn't want to pay for through their veterinarian. But the problem with having that stuff go through a non-FDA approved manufacturing facility is that there's not somebody keeping an eye on the sanitary conditions, and a lot of those products were injectable products. So yeah, they talk about finding things floating in injectables. They also, in the documentation with Mangini, talk about finding mold in a lot of injectable products. And Mangini's alerted to this and kind of says, oh, don't worry about it. Like, it's not a big deal. I mean, that can kill a horse pretty easily. So it's really horrifying.
You'd think that the states, the regulators would, and I know in Florida they really don't have a racing commission, but you'd think that regulators in other states would look a lot more carefully at the vendor licenses they hand out to people that are in the backstretch, just going up to people and peddling stuff that, that, as we said earlier, the trainers don't know what it is. The vets don't know what it is. I'm not even sure that the people peddling it know what it is as far as the ingredients are concerned.
No, and one of the reasons that when I had investigated those websites, Horse Pre-Race and Racehorse Meds, I'd focused on them because they were online. So I could learn a lot about what customers were being told about the product, and I could try to figure out who was making this stuff. Although mostly what I learned is they don't want you to know who's making the stuff. But I've been told that there's kind of at least as big a market, or maybe a bigger market, for stuff that isn't like marketed via the internet, where you just have a rep and the rep finds a way to access a training center or even a racetrack, and they just go barn to barn and talk to people. And there's not that kind of digital record of what people are being sold and what they're being told it is and what it does. And so you really have to wonder, like, how much of this is still kind of underground, because it's not something that you'd know about unless you were physically there when someone happened to sell it. It's really, really unsettling.
One of the defendants in the case, allegedly, someone who's not pleaded guilty, allegedly had hundreds of products and would custom design products for specific trainers. And I think it was the government alleged it's because if they caught one person using something, they didn't want to catch other people. So they would slightly change the formula. We've heard how designer drugs are done that way, that you might have a test for one specific drug, but you can just change the formula a little bit and that test won't work for the other drug. So these, when the government hires people to break hackers, computer hackers, they hire hackers that have made a criminal career out of it. I think if HISA wants to figure out what to do about doping, some of these people involved in this case could be very, very valuable to them in showing them how it's done, because these are much more sophisticated, I think, than a lot of people give them credit for.
Yeah, and one thing that I had sort of begun to discover when I had been doing earlier reporting on this is also just that the drug names change, the formulas may change, the company names and branding change, but you have to know the people, because Robinson and Mangini both had a lot of different kind of businesses, some together and some separately. And if they got an FDA warning letter on one omeprazole product, then they'd change the name. They would change the coloring of the logo. Typically, the logo remained pretty recognizable from one version to the next named version, and they'd go on. And I think that probably there are a lot of people with very sophisticated operations who know how to do this stuff. But I think when they do kind of get, some scrutiny on them, they just sort of regenerate in a different way, or they pair together with a different person. And so having somebody on the inside is probably really the only way to start tracing this stuff, because they'll just come back in a different format.
Yeah. Well, Natalie, I know our readers know how valuable your reporting is covering these issues. And this week I learned that the U.S. Attorney feels it's pretty valuable too. They included your story on the compounding pharmacies that involve Robinson and Mangini. They included that in the evidence submitted with the pre-sentencing report that they gave to the judge this week. So congratulations on that.
That was a little strange. I was just scrolling through documents and it's like, why am I on our website? Oh, why?
Yeah. Well, this is not the last time we'll talk about this, I'm sure, because there are many more defendants whose cases have not been resolved. And I think once, if the judge rules in favor of the U.S. attorney here, we get guilty pleas, I think we're going to start seeing a second round of indictments. I know we've been talking about that since March of 2020, but I do believe it's going to happen.
I keep hearing that as well. I've gotten several different people now telling me, and they're not involved with the case, but people are saying now, oh, before the end of the year. The end of the year is when it's going to all come out. By then, who knows? But we'll be watching.
Well, thanks again for your work on this ongoing case. And I'll be joined by Joe Nevels when we come back after taking a look at this week's Star of the Week at Woodbine.
Around the outside, Bellanina's gone up to join a little Voodoo. Sansa's Vow on the outside. In the center, Dictate, Revere the Rail. Erasmo's Girl is next from Admonish at the top of the lane. A little Voodoo in front. And in second placing is on the outside, Sansa's Vow from Bellanina and Revere. And now going on, a little Voodoo. A little Voodoo in front. Sansa's Vow, Bellanina the center. And then came Revere, but it's Sansa's Vow on the outside trying to get by. A little Voodoo. Bellanina in the center. Three of them. Bellanina comes through, has hit the front and saved up for that last punch. And it's a purple patch of form for Bellanina. Another one. 4 in a row. Bellanina by about a length and 3/4 at the wire.
That's right, ladies and gents. Our Woodbine Star of the Week is Bellanina, a 6-year-old daughter of Tisway who won a turf allowance on September 6th by a length and 3/4. Now, Bellanina is a perfect 4 for 4 this year, all under jockey Daisuke Fukumoto, and this might have been her biggest test yet. Those first 3 wins all came at a mile or shorter, and her most recent win came at 1.25 miles. So really a big step up here and a very game effort.
Yeah, this was a horse that was claimed for just $7,500 in December of 2019, winless last year and perfect this year in 4 starts. So trainer Ralph Biamonte has really figured this one out. And what I haven't figured out is what the heck was Robert Geller talking about with his Australian accent trying to sound Italian?
Listen, if your announcer can't have a good time during the races, who else is supposed to? I'm just glad that he's having a good time. He's enjoying himself, having some fun up there. The races have to be fun. If they're not, what are we even doing here?
He's one of the best. Anyways, that is it for our Woodbine Star of the Week. Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks to Natalie Voss for joining us earlier to talk about another part of the business. And we'll be back next week with another edition of the Friday Show. Thanks to Woodbine for the Star of the Week sponsorship and to Monmouth Park for their ongoing sponsorship throughout the meeting. Still a few weeks left at Monmouth Park. We'll see you next week.